1945. White flakes descended like cinders onto the timber rooftops of Camp Miles Standish in Massachusetts. A convoy of military vehicles arrived beneath overcast skies, their motors gradually falling silent. Within them sat 70 Japanese women, gazes directed straight ahead, spines held rigidly upright. The majority had previously worked as nurses, administrative staff, or interpreters. They had endured aerial bombardments, maritime transfers, and now found themselves imprisoned by their adversaries. Yet, what transpired next defied all expectations. A junior American sentry, perhaps in his early 20s, moved closer as one of the women disembarked from the vehicle. His manner wasn't derisive. It carried no cruelty, merely curiosity. "Allow me to see your hair loose." The woman recoiled as though physically struck. A profound silence swept through the assembled prisoners like an electric charge. He spoke again, his voice softer this time, seemingly unaware of the gravity of his request. Consider that moment carefully. Hair loose. Throughout Imperial Japan, particularly for women serving in official capacity, hair represented discipline. It symbolized identity itself. To unfasten it was never casual. It constituted something intimate, degrading. Even in their defeat, they had maintained it secured, orderly, concealed, and now a foreigner in an unfamiliar uniform wanted to witness it undone. Within the detention facility, one woman, mid-20s, bearing a rigid posture, pallid from ocean passage, raised her hand. Trembling digits reached toward her bun. One fastener, then another. Gradually her hair came free, cascading like dark silk against her military attire. The American soldier offered no laughter. He simply observed. Inside the guard station, someone murmured, "She appears human now." And in that instant, everything fractured. The remaining women stared, immobilized. One whispered beneath her breath, "Yamit, cease." Another averted her face toward the barrier. For the Americans, it signified nothing. For the women, it represented exposure, disgrace, perhaps even treachery. Over 4,000 Axis prisoners passed through Miles Standish. Merely approximately 70 were Japanese women, and on that snow-laden morning, the initial cultural collision concerned neither weapons nor commands. It centered on a single strand of hair. Yet, it wasn't finished. That minor act would ignite something volatile within the barracks. Tensions, culpability, defiance, all of it hovering just beneath the surface. And it would commence with the sound of hair fasteners striking the floor. She shed no tears. She uttered no words. Her countenance remained motionless, as stone, while her hair unraveled before everyone assembled. The barracks carried the scent of moist wool and metal sleeping frames. Canvas barriers fluttered in the wind beyond. Within, time seemed suspended. The woman, unnamed, merely numbered, had allowed her hair to fall to her shoulders. Dense black, scrupulously maintained. Its descent resonated louder than gunfire. The American guards displayed no reaction. They stared. One leaned forward and muttered almost with reverence, "She doesn't resemble the others now." For them, it was perhaps a tender moment. Curiosity, perhaps. For her fellow captives, it was pure fracture. Within imperial military doctrine, Japanese women in uniform maintained their hair tightly secured. High arrangement, zero loose strands. The concept wasn't merely hygienic. It was unity, no vanity, no individuality, purely functional. Releasing it publicly, especially before men, wasn't an act of comfort. It was an act of capitulation. Another prisoner covered her mouth. One turned away, revolted. Then the murmurs began. Words like "Yurajuri mono," traitor, hazukashi, shameful. This was no longer about the American soldier. This concerned all the specters they carried. In that moment, a delicate social contract shattered. For months, these women had maintained each other tightly bound, not merely physically, but emotionally. They shared nothing, confessed nothing, survived in silence. Discipline was all they possessed, and she had violated it for a stranger's observation. One woman rose. She was older, a former medical orderly by her bearing. Her steps were deliberate, but her intention was unmistakable. She crossed the space, pulled the girl's hair forward, and regarded it as though it were decay. Then she departed without utterance. The space felt colder afterward. Documents from Camp Miles Standish, dated February of 1945, mention unusual emotional disturbances among Japanese female prisoners. That sanitized terminology for what actually occurred. A gradually burning emotional rebellion, because the following morning, something shocking unfolded. A scream pierced through the barracks. Metal drinking vessels clattered to the floor. One woman had taken a dull razor to her own hair during the night. Another had stolen mess hall scissors to accomplish the same. Not to style, to punish. That was not hair, that was surrender. A phrase muttered by one of the prisoners, half whisper, half malediction. The act had broken something sacred, yet what followed wasn't fury. It was division. The women weren't unified anymore. And when order collapses inside a cage, something else invariably fills the vacuum. That night, the cold inside the barracks felt sharper than the wind beyond. Blankets clung to shaking shoulders. Metal cups sat untouched, but slumber never came, because shame had metastasized into something darker, rage. It commenced with a scream, short, sharp, not from pain, but fury. Then the unmistakable sound of metal scraping timber. One woman unidentified in United States records had taken scissors from a cleaning kit and chopped her own hair unevenly. Jagged edges, no mirror, merely blind fury. Another held her down, slicing off what remained. They didn't speak, didn't need to. The message was clear. If you won't carry our shame, we'll carve it into you. By morning, 3 women had self-inflicted cuts. 2 had visible bald patches, and 1, the original woman who released her hair, refused sustenance. Documents indicate she curled beneath her bunk and didn't move for hours. Guards noted internal discipline issues, but they didn't see the complete picture. Inside, it wasn't about the Americans anymore. It was about control, who still possessed it and who relinquished it. A former Imperial clerk stood in the center of the barracks, barking commands as though they remained on a base near Yokosuka. She demanded silence, demanded obedience, and when one girl cried, she spat at her boots. One prisoner later wrote, "We feared each other more than the guards." This wasn't hyperbole. Camp records from March of 1945 list 3 emotional disturbances among Japanese women. What that truly meant: psychological collapse, sleep deprivation, pure punishment. One woman attempted to dig under the barrier with a spoon, not to escape, but just to remain awake. The Americans, baffled by the internal breakdown, finally brought in an interpreter, a Nisei soldier, Japanese-American, fluent in both languages and both cultures. He wasn't armed, just a clipboard, thick accent and exhausted eyes. He sat down with the most senior woman and asked quietly, "Do you understand why he asked you to release your hair?" She stared back blank, as though the question itself made no sense. But she didn't know the genuine shock. He wasn't there to interrogate. He was there to explain, because the American guards weren't attempting to humiliate them. They were attempting to understand them. And what followed next would flip the entire narrative. The interpreter didn't raise his voice. He simply pulled up a stool, sat at eye level with the senior prisoner, and allowed the barracks to settle into an uneasy silence. The women observed him with the same distrust they had reserved for an enemy officer, but he wasn't that. Not quite. His coat declared United States Army. Yet his face, his posture, his quiet hesitation. They recognized something familiar in him, something unsettling. He began softly, almost apologetically. "They weren't attempting to shame you." The sentence landed like stone. The senior woman stiffened, her jaw clenched. Around them, boots shifted across the wooden floor. A few women exchanged confused glances. She finally spoke, voice razor-edged. "He requested to see her hair. That is intimate in our world, unforgivable." The interpreter nodded. He didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his pocket and unfolded a small notepad. On it were sketches, simple outlines of faces, all identical. No detail, no hair, just blank silhouettes. He set the pages on the floor. "This is what the guards see," he said. "You all appear exactly the same to them. Same arrangement, same posture, same expression. They can't distinguish who's tired, who's sick, who's frightened." A murmur swept through the space. He continued, explaining that American soldiers had filed informal notes stating the women appeared like statues and impossible to read. Some guards even joked they were ghosts. That part he almost didn't say, but he did. The truth hung heavy. In American barracks, individuality was ordinary. Hair loose wasn't intimate. It was normal, a signal of personhood, a sign of being off-duty, relaxed, human. To them, the request wasn't humiliation. It was an attempt to understand who these women were beneath the rigid discipline. For the first time, the women hesitated. The interpreter, this bridge between two worlds, added quietly, "They weren't seeing you as prisoners. They were attempting to see you as people." The senior woman lowered her gaze, processing what that meant. Behind her, the woman who had originally allowed her hair to fall wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, not crying, just overwhelmed. If the Americans weren't mocking them, then what were they doing? Questions began to crack the rigid shell of discipline, and into that space stepped one of the guards, not with authority, but with something unexpected. He carried a wooden crate. Its edges were scuffed, the lid half open. Inside, soap bars, combs, brushes, small scissors. Not weapons, not commands, tools. A quiet apology delivered without a single word. And that crate would start mending what the night had shattered. The crate made no sound as it contacted the floor, just a dull thud, soft and strange. One American guard knelt beside it, not to speak, not to instruct. He simply slid it forward, then stepped back. No eye contact, no smirk. The women watched frozen for a full minute. No one moved. Inside the crate, bars of milky soap, metal combs, soft bristled brushes, and simple folding scissors. The kind used in mess tents. Nothing fancy. But in that moment, these were not hygiene tools. They were an invitation, one without strings. No commands were given. One woman, youngest among them, likely no older than 20, glanced sideways, then forward. She stood. Her steps were stiff, unsure, but she approached the crate and reached inside. Fingers brushed against a comb. She picked it up, ran it once through her hair, then stopped. No one spoke, but then another followed, then another. 12 women came forward that day. Not all used the tools. Some just touched them. Some stared, but 3 of them, 3 who had not spoken since arrival, smiled briefly, softly, like something had been unlocked. According to internal camp records from April of 1945, prisoner morale among female Japanese detainees notably improved following hygiene kit distribution. Unusual voluntary social interaction observed. That was the official line, but behind it was something simpler. Dignity was being offered back, not taken. They didn't want us shamed, one prisoner later said. They just wanted to see who we were. There were no guards watching closely, no cameras, just quiet moments between enemies who no longer felt like complete strangers. For the first time, a few women looked directly at the Americans, not down, not away. That day the comb did more than untangle hair. It untangled assumptions, and for one woman in particular, it became a catalyst, an inner rupture that would take weeks to make sense of. She had stayed behind as the others moved toward the crate, eyes locked on the floor, but in her hand, hidden beneath a worn sleeve, was a folded scrap of brown paper. She had been a nurse from Nagasaki, number 4867, and her story, the one she refused to tell even under interrogation, was about to rise to the surface, not through confession, but through something older, something more human. She started to write. She had touched thousands of bodies before, shrapnel wounds, burned skin, gangrene peeling off like paper. But she had never felt more exposed than in that quiet barracks, pen trembling in her fingers, writing the first real words in nearly a year. Prisoner number 4867, 24 years old, former military nurse, transferred from Nagasaki just weeks before the bomb fell. She didn't know if her childhood home still stood. She didn't know if her mother was alive. All she knew was that she had survived what she wasn't supposed to. And now she was being asked, wordlessly, gently, to be human again. She wrote in slanted Japanese script on a brown scrap torn from a supply box. Nothing formal, no reports, just thoughts, fragments like, "Their kindness terrifies me. How do I behave when there are no orders? Do I still exist without a uniform?" That morning, she combed her hair for the first time since surrender. Not because she wanted to feel clean, but because she wanted to feel real. The brush tugged against tangles she hadn't touched in months. Every stroke, a quiet act of defiance against the erasure she'd trained for. She remembered the lectures from her field medic days, how American soldiers were said to shoot prisoners, violate nurses, torture intelligence officers. But here, a wooden crate of soap, a man who didn't even look her in the eyes when he offered it. I saw more mercy in that crate of soap than in 3 years of war. That's what she wrote, then folded the paper and hid it under her sleeping mat. Over the next week, she wrote more on wrapping paper, ration labels, even a napkin from the mess tent. She documented small moments, the way one guard waited before entering their barracks, as if respecting a boundary, how another had slipped her an extra blanket during a frost snap. No words exchanged, just tiny gestures. Strange mercies. But transformation never happens in isolation. In the next cell, just one wall away, sat her former commanding officer, also a woman, cold, silent, unbending, the very embodiment of imperial discipline. She had trained the nurse, had beaten her once for shaking during a field operation. Now they were both captives, both watching the same enemy, but only one of them was beginning to change. And soon they would collide again, this time, not on a battlefield, but across the thin line between memory and survival. The barracks wall between them was barely 2 inches thick, splintered wood and rusted nails. But for prisoner 4867, it might as well have been steel. On the other side sat the woman who had once defined her entire existence, her commanding officer, a woman she had followed through field hospitals in Burma, jungle retreats in the Philippines, and starvation patrols in Saipan. She never questioned her until now. They met face to face during laundry duty. No guards, no interpreter, just the stink of wet uniforms and the hiss of boiling water. The officer didn't look older, just thinner, sharper. Her voice came like gravel dragged across concrete. "We are not women here. We are soldiers." The nurse froze. Words piled up in her throat, but none escaped. She simply stared as the older woman turned back to scrubbing blood-stained sleeves from some forgotten battle. Same rigid posture, same clipped movements. The war lived inside her bones. Flashbacks came hard. A young soldier screaming as they amputated his leg on a jungle cot. Her hands trembling, soaked in iodine. The officer's slap, clean, brutal, cracking across her face. Kill the weakness, or it'll kill him. She obeyed. She always obeyed. But now her hands held a comb, not a scalpel. Her hair was brushed. Her thoughts were her own, and her orders gone. She wanted to ask, what did it get us? But she didn't dare. By 1945, over 400,000 Japanese women had served in auxiliary roles: medics, signal operators, clerks. Their stories mostly buried, dismissed. Yet here they were, 2 of them reduced to numbers, waiting for a war to officially end. That night she wrote again. She taught me to kill the nurse in me. The Americans brought her back. She watched the officer closely the next morning, still polished, still composed, but her hand shook when tying her bun. Just for a second, a tiny tremor. And in that crack, the nurse saw something human. Maybe fear, maybe grief, but definitely not the machine she once saluted. The next evening she made a quiet decision, not to confront, not to rebel, but to remember herself. She would no longer be number 4867. She would be a daughter, a nurse, a woman who once loved a boy who never came back from the Pacific. Her next act wasn't for the Americans or the officer. It was for herself. She began writing letters, 3 of them, each one a lifeline thrown across time. She wrote 3 letters, one to her mother, if she was still alive, one to the man she was supposed to marry, if his bones were still in the ocean, and one to herself. The first letter was careful, formal, the way daughters write when they don't know if their family still recognizes their name. I am well. I eat. The Americans do not harm us. I comb my hair. That last line she underlined twice, unsure why. The second letter was brutal. You died near the Marianas. They told me you were brave. I believed them then. Now I wonder, were we all just meat for maps? She folded it, then refolded it, then stared at the creases like they could answer. The third letter, the one to herself, was messier. No grammar, no filter, just raw pieces of thought. I miss coffee. I miss silence. I miss not feeling watched. Then this, written across the page like a scar. I remember who I am when no one is yelling. She didn't intend to send them. There was no one to send them to. But writing them, she felt something shift, a reconnection to a self that hadn't existed since before her uniform, before discipline, before the war carved obedience into her skin. That week, she read fragments aloud to herself, whispering under her breath during mess line or laundry hours. A few of the other women noticed. They didn't mock her. They just listened silently. One offered her a pencil stub when hers ran out. Another offered a folded napkin, dry and clean. These were small acts, quiet but powerful. According to a United States Army intelligence report dated May of 1945, 30 Japanese women prisoners later testified formally or anonymously to psychological shifts during captivity in American camps. Not conversion, not indoctrination, just reawakening. One diary line read, "In losing the war, I remembered I was alive." And for this nurse from Nagasaki, the act of writing had become a ritual, like pulse-checking a body presumed dead. Each word helped her feel her own breath again. Still, time moved. The war would not wait for healing. Soon the orders came, prepare for repatriation. Bags packed, barracks cleaned, uniforms pressed. But before the ship arrived, she had one last thing to do, a personal ritual, quiet, final. She waited until dawn and took scissors to her own hair. Just one strand. The dawn mist curled low over Camp Miles Standish, mixing with the smoke from coal fires as trucks rumbled to life in the distance. The women lined up in silence, their bags slung over shoulders, uniforms pressed one last time. Final roll call, final count. The war had not fully ended, but for them it was about to shift from history to memory. She stood near the back, hair freshly combed, pinned neatly, eyes steady. But in her pocket, a small strand of hair tied in red thread and a match. She waited until no one was looking. Behind the mess hall, where soot stained the walls and broken crates piled like forgotten thoughts, she struck the match against a rusted pipe. The flame caught. Orange flickered against gray. She held the strand for a moment, fingers trembling just slightly. Then, without ceremony, she dropped it into the flame. It curled, blackened, disappeared. No prayer, no words, just a quiet goodbye to a version of herself she never wanted back. The soldier, the silent, the shadow. From the crate of soap to the notebook letters, the transformation hadn't been dramatic. It had been slow, human, earned. She boarded the truck without looking back. By 1946, nearly all surviving Japanese prisoners were repatriated. Most women were never formally interviewed. Some never spoke of the camps again. Shame was powerful, so was silence. But a few, like her, kept fragments tucked in drawers, folded in journals, hidden between pages of civilian life. One United States intelligence officer later noted, "Their eyes had changed. They looked at us like we were real." And maybe that was the most dangerous thing about kindness in war. It unarmed people. It rewrote enemies. As the ship pulled away from the Boston harbor, she stood at the railing. The ocean wind pulled strands of hair loose again, just for a moment. She didn't fix them. She stared into the water, hand over her chest, where a folded letter still lived. Not the one to her mother, not to her fiancé, the one she wrote to herself. What they took was small. What they gave, I still carry. That line would never be published, never recorded, but it would echo through diaries, through daughters, through the ghosts of a war that demanded all and returned nothing whole. This is how one war ended.